Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 138, part two, I guess, of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. I am your host, Gavin, and like episode 138, part one, I am not joined by my usual two co hosts, Mike and Fia. They are off doing their wonderful history and marine ecology things. But today I am joined by some wonderful guests, two of whom you have met before if you're a regular listener to the podcast. One of whom is brand new, and I'm very excited to have all three of them here with me. So if you could all go ahead and introduce yourselves. We'll start with Laura.
Hey, my name is Laura. I own a tattoo shop in Denver called Nest Art Collective.
Hi, I'm Sierra Swenson. I'm an assistant collections manager at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and I specifically work on the Late Cretaceous of Madagascar collections.
I'm Rudolph or Rudy Hummel, and I was a research assistant at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science until recently. I'm now a, what is my job title? Physical science technician, paleontology in parentheses at Fossil Butte National Monument. But today we're here to talk about stuff from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, as you might have guessed from the locations of the other two guests.
Awesome. So just for context for some of the listeners who might not know, where is Fossil Butte?
Is in southwestern Wyoming, tucked into that corner of Utah. I've taken it to calling the armpit of Utah.
Okay.
Maybe not so charitable, but it's very pretty here.
Awesome. But yeah, so this whole thing, so if you listen to the previous sort of part one of this episode, if you haven't yet, I highly recommend. It was a wonderful conversation with Sierra and then Dr. Dave Krause about the whole Madagascar project. So that's sort of the whole groundwork for what we're going to be talking about for this episode. So this is going to be more of a sort of behind the scenes, some of the deep work that actually happens once you get the fossils back to the lab. And just a little bit of reference for my knowledge. So we're going to be talking a lot about like fossil preparation, fossil conservation. Rudy, I think, knows this. I don't think it came up in our last conversation, Sierra, but so I technically did take a fossil preparation and conservation class in graduate school, but it was in spring semester 2020.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So most of it was online, and it's hard to actually learn fossil preparation through a computer screen. So my experience with it is mixed. So that's why I'm very excited to have you all on who know a little bit more, and then also some different subject matter experts than we typically get on the podcast with a tattoo artist, which is wonderful. So I guess Rudy, since you're the one who sort of organized both of these conversations to start with, I guess why don't you talk about your sort of experience with this project and why you thought it'd be cool to talk about.
Yeah, so this starts basically about a year ago, actually, at the beginning of my year-long contract at DMNS. One of the primary jobs that I was given to do, my boss was Dave, so naturally I was doing some Madagascar things. And one of my jobs was to basically perform collections management duties for not necessarily the fossils themselves, but the silicone molds of those fossils that were made during the 2000s. These days, we do a lot more 3D printing and scanning for our replicas, but we had like 700 molds of Madagascar fossils that had been shipped from Stony Brook, where Dave had originally been, to Denver, and then basically just unloaded into cabinets and never touched after that. So they were in various states of organization and labeling. And my job was basically to get them organized, compress them into fewer cabinets, and label them appropriately because they're still usable molds.
Right.
Molding and casting that's still a good way to make replicas. For those of you who are not in the know, you have your fossil, you make usually a silicone mold of it in two pieces, and then you can pour a casting agent like plaster or resin into that mold. And then when you like flex the mold, once the resin is cured, you can pop out a plastic replica of whatever you were trying to replicate. And a single mold can produce multiple casts. So having a collection of 700 molds is great because it means that those are all fossils that you can still produce casts of. So that's
really important for like we were talking about in the last part of this sort of two-part series with a lot of the holotypes,
Hmm.
which this collection has a ton of because those are irreplaceable. And so the less people have to physically touch those to
Yeah.
actually get information from them, the better. But that's
And
awesome.
not only, yeah, not only that, but because half of the collection from the beginning, half of the collection plus the holotypes was always planned to go back to Madagascar. So from the very
Yeah.
beginning, replicating fossils was a really big part of this project. That's why so many molds were made when they were, because replicas of things going back to stay here are great. And of course, things that are, I say here, I'm in Wyoming now, but things that are staying in Denver that any Malagasy colleague wants to look at, we need to send them a replica of that. Um, so yeah, that was kind of the impetus for getting all of these organized so that we could get I mean, they hadn't even exactly been fully inventoried. So getting an inventory of what we had, what we want to make casts of, and what we need to send back to Madagascar. And then the problem arose because I was trying to label these things. I hadn't worked with silicone molds much before, and silicone is hydrophobic. It repels water, including marker pigment.
Right.
So Sharpie, some of these have been labeled in Sharpie, and even after drying for, I mean, I could write on one with Sharpie and wipe it off after 3 seconds. I could also wipe a Sharpie label off after 10 years, which I figured out pretty quickly. And so, so a lot of these were like, kind of like, okay, well, what specimen does this go with? And a lot of them were stamped. You can stamp labels into the silicone before it cures. But the problem is, a lot of these were molded for research purposes before they were ever cataloged. So some of them are stamped with the
Mm,
catalog number, which is the number that they get
right.
when they arrive at the museum. And some of them were stamped with the field number, which is the number that they get when they're collected. So they were not consistently labeled. Some of the labels were wrong. You can't fix a label if you get it wrong, if it's stamped, because the silicone is now cured and you can't repeat that process. So we experimented with I mean, we were just brainstorming for a few days in the lunchroom, me and Dave and Sierra. And Sierra, I'll turn it over to you for the next part.
Sure. I mean, considering we have a tattoo artist here with us, it may be obvious the solution that we ended up coming to, but I suggested that we maybe try tattooing, um, kind of almost as like a throwaway, like, could it really work? And the more we thought about it and looked into it, the more we were like, maybe we really could make this work. And Rudolph did this great sort of cost analysis of the other possible solutions to this labeling issue. And it was very clear from that tattooing, buying just a cheapo set of tattoo equipment was way more cost effective potentially than the other options we had talked about, which were these like little stickers or this like dental gel stuff that would cure onto the top of the molds.
Huh.
Um, and
Both of those
then,
were going to cost over $1 per label.
yeah,
Oh, wow.
versus the tattoo equipment, if you buy a very cheap tattoo machine and supplies on Amazon, you can get like kits. And Laura will agree, we don't recommend this for people. Um, but if you do that, we spent, I think, like 40 or so dollars on the kit, and then we bought archival ink separate. So instead of using tattoo ink, archival ink, and that was like 15 or $20. And that was it for the whole
Okay.
thing,
Wow.
which is a lot less than $1 per mold.
Yeah. So I guess what is the difference between a regular like pen ink or a tattoo ink and archival ink?
Uh,
Um,
And you know,
I
you don't need
mean,
to get into like the deep chemistry of it or anything, but just so the listeners know why does that matter?
sure.
um, I guess the best explanation I could give is that, and I guess I actually, I'll admit, I don't really know because I don't know what the properties of tattoo ink are compared to
That's fair.
archival ink, but we wanted to go for the archival ink, hoping that like it would last longer, it wouldn't off gas anything weird. Like, I don't know what the tattoo ink would really do.
We had a
And
difficult time finding out what was in tattoo ink.
yeah, I
Hmm.
think we just wanted to play it safe.
Or I guess specifically how the components of tattoo ink would work in a long-term labeling
Yeah.
system. What were you going to say,
Okay.
Laura?
Well, it's just funny because I know what's in tattoo ink, and I did look into this after that one day, and from what I can tell, it's just the difference in the pigment. It's the
Okay.
same like medium that holds the pigment. So tattoo ink
Sure.
is the liquid part and the pigment part. And it's funny because the archival, I noticed it while I was working with it. It's so like thick. It's like more viscous than tattoo ink. So I don't know. I think it probably just isn't designed like there's like the human blood element of like tattooing
Sure.
people.
Sure.
And then for like an archival ink, it's being used on what? Paper,
Mhm.
you know, like not a person. So I
Yeah.
think there's just that element of like, there's no like wet part, you know,
Yeah.
there's no wet element of the
Right.
ink. So I don't exactly know the difference because it was actually for me to find which pigment was in the archival ink.
Hmm.
I
was like
had a
what
hard
makes it
time
archival.
figuring that out too. It was like
Yeah.
a lot of research was easy to find on like archival ink can last this long in a museum label, and it's been tested for like these things, but it was really difficult to figure out why. Like, what is
Yeah.
it in the archival ink that actually makes it work like this? And it was difficult for me to compare that with the tattoo ink. This was before Laura was in the picture, so I kind of figured like, well, at least with the archival ink, it's been tested in museum settings. The tattoo ink might work. We still don't know.
Sure. Yeah.
And Laura, you said
From
you've
what I can
seen
tell,
tattoo ink in silicone for as long as like 15 years, right?
yeah. I mean, people tattoo silicone for practice all the time, and that's like kind of the like standard for like apprentices at this point. But people
Okay.
also like they make silicone like hands or like silicone faces, or and people tattoo them like to show off what they can do, and they like display it at a convention. So you see this, you know, tattooed hand that's been traveling around with Joe Schmo at the convention for the past 15 years, carry around this tattooed hand with him, and it stays in. I mean, you could probably like scrub the ink out if you wanted to, but not unless you're like rubbing it with Clorox, you know what I mean?
Sure. And yeah, going back to the cheapo tattoo gun. So I don't even know if Rudy knows this. I have 4 tattoos. Most people who meet me, I don't seem like a person who likes or would have multiple tattoos. My first one, I got though it was definitely from a very cheapo tattoo, and after my subsequent ones, I could definitely tell the difference. So just speaking a little from experience there, it definitely makes a huge difference.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
and also, if I can step on my little soapbox about this, just at the
Of
beginning of
course,
this
please do.
conversation, the Amazon, the pen machine that you purchase on Amazon that so many people have been buying isn't graded for human use because it's not properly cleanable.
Oh,
So that is the difference. And that's the thing that these people don't understand. And I'm not a gatekeeper. I don't think you need an apprenticeship. I think being self-taught is a thing, etc. I'm not trying to like stop people from learning to tattoo. I'm trying to stop people from spreading bloodborne pathogens.
sure.
Yeah.
So unless your machine can fully come apart and you can fully clean the whole inside of it, and you are positive that no ink is getting up into the mechanism during the procedure, then your machine is not rated for human use. So this machine, it's not like you can't disassemble it. So it's just the pen with the motor inside, and you put the cartridge in. But then it's like, okay, so I take my cartridge out, I table, I put a new cartridge in. If there's ink in there, it could. I mean, if you had been using it on a human, their blood is now inside of the machine, and you cannot get it out.
Yeah.
So, and like the little kit it comes with, you know, it comes with one pair of gloves. It doesn't come with like a cord cover or like a any sort of wrap to put it on. So I think it's just like implied that like, oh, you can just use this, which
It
is
does
like so
actually
not true.
say in the instructions that you should not use it on humans. And I think the
Oh,
companies
good.
making them know that that's what people are going. I
Okay.
think that's still why they're
It's
making
just
them,
a
because
like a
Oh,
they
of
know.
liability
course.
thing.
But right, it's
Yeah.
they're aware that it's not terribly safe, and they're covering their butts by putting that in the instructions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just like not graded for, and I'm such a like, I'm so worried about germs all the time. Did you know that
Sure.
hepatitis lived on a hard surface for 7 days? So
Really?
if you
Oh,
tattoo with someone with, yes, if you tattoo them with hepatitis, the next 7 days worth of tattoos potentially are spreading that hepatitis around. It makes
Oh
me so
God.
nervous all the time. So, and of course, that's like I was a germaphobe before I was a tattooer, and then I became a tattooer, and then I was a germaphobe before COVID, and then COVID happened, and now I'm just like disinfectant. You know?
Um,
Also, the needles are just not as good. Like they're just wobbly. They're not as consistent. They're not polished properly, etc.
and so I guess let's talk a little bit about your experience with tattooing the silicone. You said people use that a lot anyway. Artists use that as to do tests or to show off their work. What, if anything, was different about this for you than a regular day at work?
I guess the aspect of like the longevity, like when you're practicing on silicone as an apprentice, like if you go a little too deep, it's like almost like a learning experience of like, oh, this is what it feels like when you go too deep or whatever. But these are obviously like delicate and important, and you if you go too deep, it could like potentially tear or ruin the silicone. So just like to me, a silicone piece is like, oh, I'm just gonna try this, and then if it doesn't work, I'll throw it away. But with this, it's like just as important as a human tattoo, and it has to be just as pretty and last just as long, or I guess longer, depending on. Yeah. Anyway, silicone can't die. I mean, um, so yeah, it's basically tattooing a human, but it's plastic instead.
Okay.
So
Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
if
Rudy.
it's okay, I think either Lora or Sierra sharing the story of like how Lora got involved with this
Yeah.
project would be really cool, because it I think really highlights why it's so important to think of science as including art.
Yeah,
I've
I
never
mean,
actually heard the story from Laura's perspective, but I know Sierra tells it well as well. So
well, I'll tell the first part because the first part was before Laura even really knew about the project. The first part is that I have tattoos. Our friend Annika, who works at the museum, also has tattoos. And she told Rudy and I about, she was like, hey, I was on Instagram looking at Friday the 13th flash days, and this ad came up for a flash day at Nest Art Collective that said it was sponsored by DMNS and that DMNS was going to be there. And we had already started doing this tattoo thing at that point, so we
in
were
fact,
both like,
we had already canvassed local tattoo shops that we might be willing to ask for advice, and
Wow.
Nest Art Collective was on that list.
yeah, we were like trying to decide who to reach out to. And so we saw this and we were like, okay, we need to figure out who's doing this, who's going there, and why, and can we be involved? And this is perfect. So we asked around, figured out it was some folks in E&P at the museum, which is like
Can you say what that
education
is
and
first? Oh, okay.
yeah, I think it's education and programming. Is that right,
Engagement
Ruda?
and programming,
Engagement and
maybe? I
programming?
don't
Okay.
remember. Engagement and
Uh,
partnerships, that's it.
engagement and
Sorry,
partnerships.
Zach and
We
Kira.
got there in the end. I'm
Got
so
there
sorry to
eventually.
them.
Every
But
time I
Zach and
talk to
Kira,
Zach, I'm like, yeah, I'm like, what is your title again? Yeah, anyway.
It's the largest department in the museum, but I
it
never remember
is.
what it stands for.
Oh wow.
Anyway, so they were the ones putting it on. They were gonna go and bring a a microscope that was connected to a screen so that people could look at their tattoos under the microscope, brand new, like after they got them, and it would be fun. And we were like,
Huh.
hey, we're doing this project. Could we maybe come with you? And they were so totally down for it, even though it was like slightly last minute. And we put together a table with casts and molds and brought our tattoo stuff and brought a bunch of molds to tattoo. And that's how we met Laura. So I'll let Laura go from there about
Well,
what all
Yeah.
happens next. But
yeah. So I guess how I got hooked up with DMNS anyway is because Zach, who was in EMP, engagement and programming, he literally, when I was an apprentice, he was a walk-in tattoo for me. I met him when he was like a literal child. He walked in and was like, I want a tattoo right now. And I was like, brand new baby, like had just started like taking walk-ins. And I was like, okay, like, but very quickly we became friends, and I've tattooed him, what, 100 times now. He affectionately He has what we call the Lora leg, as we affectionately call it, because I've tattooed it so many times. And so he messaged me and was like, I'm trying to like judge the museum. I want to do something that's gonna like engage people. I want people to be excited about science. I want people to be excited about art. He was like, you own a business. You're like kind of an institution in the area. What can we do? And so we were talking about, could I come to the museum and do like an adult night? Could they come to Nest and do some sort of event? And then I was like, well, I don't really have on the day to day. We're typically appointment only. So then I was like, well, what's like an event that we do? And then I was like, oh my gosh, October, Friday the 13th is a big flash day for us. And it's not always October. The next one's in September, for example. But I don't know if you're familiar, but Friday the 13th events, you go in and you kind of just wait in line or like sign up on a list. And it's just like little flash tattoos, flash being stuff that's like small, repeatable, like easy to get. And it's usually like super discounted. Like it used to be like $13 tattoos. Unfortunately, the economy has pushed us into higher pricing. But it's still a chance to get like a little tiny, like fun tattoo for pretty cheap. And it's kind of like a cult thing, not like cult, but like campy cult. You know what I mean? Like Rocky Horror is like a cult classic.
Sure.
It's like a cult classic moment for tattoo people that like tattoos, and people like collect them. They're like, oh, this is from Friday the 13th in 2020, 2022, 2020, whatever, and they just like keep little mementos. Yeah. So Zach was like, well, we were like, what if we do Friday the 13th? And so he came up with the idea for the microscope. And they were, I think, looking at tattoo needles as well under there. And just people being like, oh my gosh, look at how fast it moves, or look at how cool it is, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I feel really bad because he called me like a week before and he was like, guess what? And I was like, what? And he was like, we're going to tattoo fossils. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he was so excited. He was like, you're going to love this. And I was like, okay. But the deal with Friday the 13th is that I literally work 12 to 16 hours. I do 40 tattoos in one day. I was like, nice to meet you. Bye. Like,
Sure.
Don't call me. I'm busy. Like, if you need something, my assistant is here taking phone numbers down. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I didn't even get to see what was going on. But it was really cool because then obviously we hooked up later and met up and got to actually talk about the whole situation. And that's how I ended up volunteering, because I was like, you guys are doing an amazing job. Like, tattooing is not easy. I think, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but it's hard to get the hang of sometimes. And I was like, I can do this smaller and faster. So why don't we just like have artists come in and like do batches of these at the same time so that we can just get it over with, especially since we had limited time with the museum.
Yeah. And Laura also brought a ton of needed expertise about needle cartridge types and products and things like that, and actually helped us test a bunch of these different, particularly the needle cartridge arrangements, to see what worked best and what was kind of easiest to use. So we have a manuscript we're working on for publication on kind of like,
Oh, cool.
the things that we'd recommend and what worked best for us and things like that. That Laura was really integral to that whole process.
And I think just because I have like the license, like I buy again supplies that are just higher quality. Like they're not necessarily cheaper, but they're definitely like not wobbly, and they're, and for the supplies you guys had, you were doing a really, really good job. So don't downplay it.
So I know very little. I know there's lots of different models and things of tattoo guns. But I know, so before the tattoo folks got involved, when you guys were doing this yourselves, I know there are lots of different pneumatic tools in paleontology labs. How did those kinds of things compare? Because I've used lots of the little pneumatic tools. I've never used a tattoo gun. So like how was that compared to, regular fossil preparation with some of the typical tools?
Okay, first, I'll let Rudolph take this one because I actually don't have as much prep experience and I haven't used like air scribes and things like that. But I will say, we're not saying tattoo gun. It's a machine.
Okay.
Yeah, machine.
I wasn't gonna
or
say
pen
it.
if it's a pen style, but
Okay.
I'll give you that.
It's like a thank you, Sarah. It's like a thing it's like a thing in the industry of like, so it's been such a like biker style, like tattoos hurt. And we kind of are trying to step away from that. And I'm just like, I'm not inflicting violence. It's like a silly. It's just a
No,
pedantic
no,
thing, but
that's
it is meaningful, I think.
oh no, thank you.
So holding it felt like holding an air scribe,
Okay.
which is a little pneumatic tool that we use for preparing fossils. So that part, it was like, oh yeah, okay. But then the moment you start using it, it feels completely different, because with an air scribe, you're using I mean, it's still a vibrating needle. It should be similar, right? But you're using it for such a different purpose. You're literally shattering rock with the air scribe. And so where you put it and how long you hold it there and how much pressure you apply and like how like the even like the length of the needle all felt completely different. And as soon as I started actually using it, it didn't really feel very similar to an air scribe at all.
Okay.
The needle is just so much thinner and pointier. And trying to, I mean, if you imagine trying to write with an air scribe, with a tool normally used to destroy sections of rock, it's kind of different.
Yeah, I bet.
It like just the act of writing versus etching was kind of different.
Yeah, and
Have you ever
okay. No, go ahead.
no, I was gonna ask if you've ever like burned wood,
Oh,
like wood carving. It feels like that a little bit, but like
okay.
vibrating.
Huh.
But it's like the same, like if if you're holding the hot tip to the wood too long, it'll like,
Right.
it'll be thicker, that type of thing. And then it's like the speed and like the depth that you use is
I think
almost the
the
same.
depth was the part that was most different from the air scribe, because with the air scribe, you're just hitting the outside of the rock. And with the
Right.
needle, you have to actually have it like in the substance you're tattooing.
Mhm.
And for listeners, an air scribe basically is just like a little tiny, like handheld air-powered jackhammer, more or less. Um, so yeah, I can see how it would feel similar at first, but yeah, the depth is like something you're aware of because that's what you absolutely don't want necessarily with the air
Right.
scribe, because at a certain point you're just wrecking the fossil. Um, but yeah, where that's a little bit the point with the tattoo machine.
Right.
But yeah, so once things sort of got rolling, how many people were sort of volunteering their time working on this from the tattoo shop?
Huh.
Oh, we had
What
at
did
least
our
five
numbers
come
end up
through.
be? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Ask another question. I can pull up a list.
Oh, okay.
Ask another question.
Give me time.
So I know at least for most of my tattoos are relatively small. They took hour and a half. But obviously that's a little more detailed than just writing a number. So how long did it take usually per mold?
When we first started, it took a little longer because we were being
Right.
really careful. And so maybe like a couple minutes per mold, but I'd say by the end, and with the tattoo artist, definitely that number came down. So maybe like 3 or 4 minutes down to like 1 minute,
Oh wow.
or less, honestly,
Yeah.
depending.
Well, and it depends. Yeah, those like really little ones that were like coin
Yeah,
sized or smaller, those took me a long time because I was so
I bet.
nervous. And on
definitely.
some of them, I was doing like the edge instead of the top
Yeah.
because the top was too thin.
Imagine, Gavin, two quarters stacked on top of each other, and the top
Hmm.
and bottom of that mold is too thin to label. So Laura literally held it sideways and stitched the
Oh
numbers into
man.
a surface literally 2 quarters thick.
Imagine 1/4, actually. I would say closer to 1/4 at times,
Wow.
tattooing
Yeah,
the edge of a single quarter.
that one that little mold. Literally, I like lost sleep about it because I saw on the day that we like were demonstrating, and then I went home and was like, "How am I gonna make this work?"
And Sierra and I
But
could
yeah,
never have done that. Like
Yeah.
Laura
Right.
having that much experience is the reason that one was able to get labeled so safely and so effectively. So like I mean we could have still written a paper about this innovative method ourselves, but involving Laura in the process opened so many doors to possibilities just to make it better, basically. And to further demonstrate that, the labels themselves were better when tattoo artists were doing them,
Yeah,
because
for sure.
like there were some molds where a single mold had multiple specimens in it. And Laura was able to find and some of the other tattoo artists, unique ways to, like, some of them would like share the same field number, but have other different numbers, or share a catalog number, but have different field numbers. And I would have just written a label out 6 times with repetitive information, but Laura was able to find ways to arrange the information that was extremely intuitive to look at, and like pretty self-explanatory, without using nearly as much time or ink. And honestly, it just looks better.
Well, I think, yeah, that one, I remember the one you were talking about. It had like the field number in the middle, and then I went around the stuff, so you had to like turn it like a wheel, so the information didn't get like confused. I don't know.
One
It didn't
field
look like a
number in the
spreadsheet, it looked
center,
like a wheel.
right? And then like
Yeah,
spokes of the wheel coming out from the center, the other specimen numbers.
yeah.
So it looked good, and it was clear looking at it that like, oh, the same field number applies to each of these. They're all kind of pointing at that same field number.
And I remember
Right.
doing that, and then I did it without asking, and then I was like, man, I hope this is okay. And you were like, this is great. And I was like, thank God, because that's how it looks.
Yeah, and just for reference, for our listeners who haven't spent a bunch of time in, paleontological or any kind of collection space, all these different, things being one number in some contexts and being a different number in other contexts, that's totally normal. That's just kind of the way the information travels throughout the process of finding a fossil out in the field and then bringing it back to the lab to then get worked on. So it might sound overly complicated, but there is a method to it. It definitely was worse in the past. So that's, and I mentioned this earlier, where it was some of the things like, labeled, not stellarly from, the original collection from Stony Brook that got brought over. That just happens. That's just, part of the field. And so I know some of my collection that I worked on in graduate school was less than great. There would be several elements. So like they'd be all the same bone, but obviously very clearly from different animals, different individual animals, but all under the same specimen number, which if I had hair, I would have pulled it out, because that's not cool. But yeah, so that's just kind of par for the course. Some of these things, maybe not in this particular context with Madagascar, but in paleontology, a lot of stuff has been collected 100 years ago or more, and sometimes that's just the way it is. But so that's not at all throwing shade at this particular collection. That's just how it is in paleontology.
Right.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
absolutely.
And
I mean,
to kind of double down on what you just said, Gavin, the stamp labels were actually very, very useful. We couldn't have done this without those. So I dissed them earlier for having some flaws, but they were way better than having nothing. And I'm really grateful to the
course.
people who put them in. What were
Yeah.
you going to say, Sierra?
Oh, I was just going to say this project's over 30 years old and has had such a wide variety of people working on it. Like, even besides issues with the molds and the casts, there are plenty more with the actual fossils themselves.
Oh, of
And
course.
we know this and we accept it, and it's why I have a job. So it's a-okay. But,
Yep.
that's what we're all working on as collections managers a lot of the time.
So yeah, I guess we'll like I said toward the beginning, having a non-paleontologist or even like non-scientist on the podcast. This might be the first that we've had besides our usual co-host Mike, who's a high school history teacher. So I love getting sort of quote unquote outsiders opinions on this kinds of thing. So yeah, so how was your experience working with the museum and sort of just being in a different environment than a typical tattoo shop?
I'm such a nerd. This is the greatest thing I've ever done. I'm never going to shut up about it. Anybody who listens, I'm like, let me tell you about the time that I got to tattoo fossils. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to the layman, it's kind of hard to explain. Like, this is why we have the molds. Like, I don't exactly, you know what I mean? I'm assuming
Yeah.
it's for education and for sharing back and forth. And I have learned all of that now. But at
Sure.
first I was like, why are we doing this? And quite frankly, I can't tell you the difference between the field number and I just was copying from
Sure.
the tags that Rudy made. um, I don't know what the numbers mean exactly, but I just think it's so. I think the merging of art and science is so important for so many different
Yeah.
reasons. And I think that tattooing often gets overlooked as like a legitimate form of art because of
Yeah.
its history and its background. And, you know, yeah, that's like a whole other podcast episode of being honest. Um, but yeah, I just think it's, I just think it's been so amazing. And I'm eternally grateful for the welcome that I've received in this institution. I think, you know, being a heavily tattooed person and working in this industry, I'm really used to going to what I would call like a normal institution, like, you know, like a not alternative situation. Like every time I have to go to like the bank or like,
Mm.
you know, to the time I like had to go buy a car, I felt very like judged for my appearance and I felt very nervous about trying to like fit in. And I kind of lead my life a way where I don't really have to be in those spaces very frequently. And I will say that the museum is not an unsafe space. I was welcomed and treated totally normally. And, you know, for whatever reason, these people think I'm really cool, which is not true. I'm just a nerd. um, I was like, show me your dinosaurs, you know what I mean? But I'm so grateful to be in an academic space that took me seriously as an expert. Because as you can imagine, in the industry, there's, you know, every person has an opinion, and it's not that any
Yeah.
of those opinions are wrong. It's just that some people are louder than others and that type of thing. So it was really fun to be able to look really scientific at it. And I think like in my daily career, I try to be as scientific as possible. It's really important to me from coming from an industry that is typically taught from like an oral tradition,
Okay.
passed down from master to apprentice. There isn't a lot of it. There's not a lot of documentation. There's not a lot
Right.
of here's why this works or why it doesn't. It's just like, oh, that's just how we've always done it. So my whole approach the whole time I've been a tattooer is if I can't explain something to a client who's asking a question, if I don't know the science, I'm going to do my darndest to find the science and figure out why this is a thing. And that's kind of led me to, you know, just like scientific endeavors. I think, you know, it's just the way I like approach life. I just think it's really important to like know the why of things. So getting to be in a scientific atmosphere is really, really fun. It was so cool. Just walk by the people preparing actual fossils.
Yeah, and so there's even some really
It's
interesting
magical.
parallels there with fossil preparation in general, because for a long time, it wasn't necessarily the researchers who were doing a lot of the prep. It was the people just in the prep room who often similarly just told each other how to do things and didn't always necessarily write down best methods and things. So only in you know relatively recent times has that become a much more broadly practiced thing. Once
Mhm.
the pandemic hit and that fossil preparation course went online, you know, we had to do a lot of reading or try to do a lot of reading about paleontological methods, and it was kind of hard to find a lot of, you know, white papers on different topics just because there weren't any. It was all
Yeah.
just stuff that preparators had passed on from one to another, just like when they go to conferences or just from, you know, uh, like you know person or like professional to apprentice sort of deal. Um, so that's really
Mhm.
interesting that those same parallels kind of show up there too.
And that ties in, I mean, a lot of collections management methods are also not
Yeah,
documented super well right now. Like, um, I don't know how many papers there are on labeling. There have been posters at conferences since at least 2005 on archival labeling, and there are summaries of best practices, which is great. But those things didn't really exist until, I mean, there weren't. It was the same problem, right? People were figuring things out in individual institutions, but not publishing it. And so
yeah,
each institution was making things up as they go and like independently inventing the same things with much time and energy. And that's one of the reasons we're so excited to publish this study, is
yeah,
so that we can enable, and actually this can roll really well into something else Laura's been thinking about a lot, but we want other institutions to be able to do this too. So we want the paper to document the process and the science behind the testing of the different needle cartridges, but also the recommendations that we have now that we've labeled a few hundred of these. with various tattoo artists' help. I looked it up. It's 8, not including Laura. And share those recommendations and suggestions with other institutions so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. And Laura has had some very, very good thoughts about that.
Yeah, because I came in and the first day I was like, oh, here's your tattoo machine. I'm going to try it if that's okay. And I was like, respectfully, this is really bad. I was like, this is hard to use, it's inconsistent, etc. Like, I just, this is why professional artists don't use these, apart from the BBP situation. So the next time brought my own machine and cartridges and professional equipment, and it just makes the process so much easier. It's more ergonomic. It obviously is much more expensive, which could be prohibitive to an institution that's wanting to try this. But I keep thinking, like, I know people that are selling their old machines, or if we could like fundraise for one, I want to build a kit that's like rentable for like a similar situation. If an institution wants to try this method, I want them to be able to have my phone number and be able to call me and say, hey, where does the needle go? If they've never like done something like this before. It's pretty, I mean, in my mind, I'm like, oh, it's so intuitive, but I can imagine looking at this like pile of stuff and being like, okay, now what? And even just like little tips and tricks of like, you can put a little Vaseline on the bottom of your ink cap to keep it from tipping over. Just little things that make your life so much easier that like you maybe wouldn't think about because you've never done it. But like, how can you know what questions to ask if you don't know? So I would really like to be like a contact or like a resource for institutions. And even if I can't like be the person, like maybe they want a team of artists to come in. I have a beautiful Instagram following of people. I travel all the time to tattoo. I've tattooed in, I'm not going to say every major city, but I go around the States. I just got back from Portland and Seattle tattooing, and I have beautiful connections there. I have connections in Chicago, New York, whatever. So if anybody is like, oh, I don't know who to call, I'm like, oh, here's a bunch of shops that I know. And you're not going to get an artist that doesn't care about science or an artist that is maybe not the nicest person. Just like reaching out, like cold calling shops. I can imagine them being like, what? Like, literally no. Yeah. Or even like maybe they wouldn't even answer. I don't know. There's such a like attitude problem in the industry, unfortunately. But on the flip side, there's also people that are extremely genuine and who I know would jump at an opportunity to do something like this. And I think another part of my experience during this whole thing is that Rudy and Sierra were like, well, how can we repay you for your time? They kind of have this attitude of like, your expertise is so important. Like, what can you do? And I was like, genuinely, I would pay to do this. Like, this is so cool. It's like, and you guys are so sweet. And like, like getting a tour of the back room of the museum is like 10 times worth being able to work with you guys. Like, it was so fun being able to ask my stupid questions about, like my whole philosophy is to ask smart people stupid questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a great
I think
philosophy.
I think it's so important. And I think that there's no such thing as a dumb question. And so I think just like being able to share information like this is like literally what humanity is about.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping the kit takes off. I guess I'm kind of relying on you guys to tell me if someone reads the paper and reaches out, or
I think
I don't know.
Well, the paper is in its final drafts. We have the 3 of us are all authors on it. And we also have a 4th co-author who was involved in some of the testing and then also has been doing some of like the microscope photography of these and putting together figures for us. So the paper's in its final, I mean, it's not in its final draft yet, but the whole manuscript is written and the figures are all but done, just some minor revisions. And so at some point, actually probably in the next few weeks, Laura, I was going to reach out to you and we'll figure out, where to put what sort of contact information or hooks for that kit to put into the paper. So if you are just interested in collections management or science or paleontology, stay tuned for that paper. We're looking at open access journals, so hopefully you won't need to pay to view it. And also, if you work at an institution that has a collection of molds that you would like labeled, stay tuned for that as well.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into we're hopefully, fingers crossed, going to be presenting this at some conferences this year as well, and that will be another great way to get in contact with us and to learn more about it, and we'll, provide maybe contact information through that medium as well so that people can reach out. And we can continue to get the word out. I heard that people were really excited about it at NAPC already,
Oh,
even though we
really?
weren't there.
None of us were
Yeah.
there.
So,
I'm so excited. I remember we did the
yeah.
talk at the museum, and I think it's not, I don't know exactly, because again, how can I know if I don't know? But it seems like it's not just paleontology that could use this. Is
I
that
don't think it
definitely.
is. I've
Yeah.
actually, in the most recent draft of the paper, I found site sources for archaeological collections that use
That
silicone
was my
molds as
first
well.
thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And then also, in the audience, our education collections manager talked about having all kinds of things that this might be worth trying on in the
Huh.
future.
Mhm.
So yeah, it might have more potential beyond just archaeology and paleontology.
Definitely.
So maybe the kit needs to have several machines in it. Just
Or
thinking,
you need
just
multiple
planning.
kits. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Multiple kits. I
A
just think it would be
paleontology
so
kit, an
cool.
archaeology kit.
Yeah, with a
Awesome.
little
So I guess,
instruction
yeah.
sheet. I'm imagining it.
And so I guess to sort of wrap up, I have a couple of questions about the paper, without giving too much away since it's still in press. Um, but so what, you mentioned earlier about your testing and your trying different things. How did you do your testing to figure out what was the best way to do it? And how did you like quantify those data?
Yeah, it would have been nice to quantify them.
Which happens, my
Yeah, it's
my
going to be a
master's
qualitative
thesis
paper.
was pretty qualitative.
Yeah.
So
A lot of it was we did standardize certain things. So like Laura is the one who does most of the label testing. I think all of it actually for each needle type. So we have the same person. We didn't have variation during testing between different tattooers. We used the same machine for the majority of the testing, the same ink and everything. We have in this collection 3 different types of silicone that are different colors and consistencies that respond to the equipment differently. So we made sure that the method worked on all 3 of those. And then the 2 that we had the most of, one of them we only had like 3 molds of, so we couldn't use it extensively in testing. But
Sure.
the 2 that we had the most examples of, we tested each needle type on each type of silicone and then got microscope photos basically to look at how it looked. And then the rest of it is largely qualitative in like Laura prefers certain needles because they write much more precisely. Another thing we had put in is that like for Sierra and I and some of the other museum employees, some of the needle cartridges were easier to use without ripping the silicone. So that kind of like balance of what works best and what's easiest to learn, with the caveat of like, if you have an expert, they
Sure.
might lean toward this direction because they'll be able to use this more effectively. Whenever I tried to use the needle that Laura liked best, I tended to tear things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the goal is really of all of the testing is to be able to provide a recommendation for a specific needle type, a specific voltage, and then a lot of what Laura was able to provide also were like tips on how you hold your hand, how you can use Vaseline, like using gloves, set up and take down, how to not make a mess.
Oh,
All
the
these things that
alcohol to
you,
clean.
yeah,
Yep,
the alcohol
yep.
to
That was
clean, we didn't
that
know
was a big
beforehand.
revelation.
I was trying to use acetone to clean the ink out of the needle
Oh.
cartridges and it was melting the plastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
so that's not particularly unusual. A lot of paleontology labs have acetone just laying around because we use it for a lot of other things. But yeah, I don't know if that would have been my go-to. But
The thing is, there was alcohol right next to it in the cabinet, and that just didn't occur to me.
It's
Yeah,
funny
there's
because like,
definitely. Oh, sorry.
oh no, I was sorry to interrupt. I was just gonna say it's funny because all of the things that Sierra just mentioned, like voltage, needle depth, how you like that is all directly transferable to a human being tattoo, including the alcohol. So I just think it's funny that if you had asked me before you even started, like, what do I need to set up, that would have been in the list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
okay.
So it's just cute.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is that some of that stuff we knew beforehand only because I had been tattooed before. And so
Right.
I was like, I know that they have these things in their setup, and I know that I get smeared with Vaseline before they tattoo me, and those kinds of things. But like
Well,
other things like the alcohol and like
Even what
the
angle to hold the
Vaseline
machine
under
at.
the ink cap, and yeah, and the angle are,
Yeah.
we never would have known.
and this is a beautiful segue into why it's so important to have a diverse staff
Yes.
in a museum
Yeah.
setting. I think, when I hear collections manager, I don't imagine like a young tattooed like femme person. And I'm just like so excited that that's a thing that's happening. So go Sierra,
Yeah. It's, I
my
mean,
hero.
it's such a perfect example of that, because I was like, I would never have thought of this. I don't have tattoos. I didn't know that they practice on silicone fake skin. There is no world in which this project would not have happened if Sierra was not in the room as a part of the discussion while we were trying to figure out labels.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And you
So
know what?
cool.
It's actually made like I have a bunch of tattoos. A lot of them before I started working at the museum were in places that were easy to cover up. But in the last like year or so, I mean I always wanted to get more in more visible places, but I think part of this project has made me realize that like it's just time to go for it. Like this is a part of my story now, having been part of this project and come up with this idea, and tattoos are how I got there, so show them off.
Hell yeah.
And I just
That's
hope that like in the future, I hope that like society is leaning. I think I'm seeing that. Like I'm seeing tattoos at banks and movie theaters and in restaurants, and I'm seeing less of the like sleeve cover situations that they like force servers to wear. You know what I mean? So, and I used to be an elementary school teacher like 10 years ago, and I had to cover my tattoos every day, and it was really
yeah.
exhausting, like mentally and physically, to like wear a hot cardigan every day in the summer. So I just hope that, I don't know, all fields go for it someday.
Yeah.
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 Granted, three of my four tattoos are easily coverable with just a t-shirt, but the other one's just right on my forearm. And even when I came and interviewed for my current job, the first day I would have worn a long sleeve shirt anyway, but I was very conscious to like keep not roll up my sleeves even though it was really warm because I didn't know how people would take it. And
Mhm.
luckily my department turned out to be really awesome. But yeah, it's like uh, something that people are like now just being more just relaxed about, like surprise that doesn't have anything to do with your ability to actually do a job. Who knew?
Right.
Thank God.
Yeah.
And in this
Yeah,
case,
we all
actually
knew.
does have to do with our ability to do
Well,
our
yeah.
job. It
Yeah.
just makes us better at it.
For
Awesome.
once.
Well,
No, just kidding.
yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you all so much for taking the time here on a at least here in Pennsylvania a little stormy night, uh, and talking to us about this really awesome project. And so I guess if anybody has any plugs or where the people can find them online, feel free.
You guys want
Go
to
ahead,
do the
anybody.
museum?
I'm not really on the social media very much, but you can follow the DMNS Instagram, Twitter, Facebook pages. We've posted once before about the project, and there might be future posts out there in the coming months.
And
So
to piggyback off that, if you're interested in the Madagascar project in general, if you listen to the first part of this episode, a big part of my job and Sierra's job over the past year has been to create a ton of social media posts on the Madagascar project itself. So only some of them have to do with tattooing, but they're just like, hey, look at this giant frog that was living in Madagascar during the Cretaceous. Like, isn't this crazy? And other really cool stuff like that. Those have been slowly getting posted since winter, and they should be continuing to get posted. So definitely follow DMNS on like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Those are the major ones, I think. Twitter to see
check
that
it out.
kind of content.
Oh,
Found
and
handle on Instagram. It's
go ahead.
sorry. The handle for the Denver Nature and Science Museum is Denver Museum NS at Denver Museum NS. I remember it not being the exact
Yeah, it's not
acronym because I'm always like,
intuitive.
where is it? Denver Museum NS
Yeah.
is the handle. So anyway, sorry, Sierra, go ahead.
I was just going to say that if you were interested in hearing and watching the pop-up lecture that Rudy, Laura, and I did at the museum, you can find it on the DMNS YouTube page. And that goes into some more detail about the needle sizing and the process itself. And it was a lot of fun to do. So.
And it has
Awesome.
pictures. If you've
And
enjoyed
pictures,
this
yes.
podcast and you want to see what these labels actually look like and look at what we're talking about with the different needle cartridge arrangements, that whole presentation, it's about 30 minutes long, and it's a PowerPoint full of pictures and stuff. So yeah, check that
Cool.
out.
I linked the YouTube on my Instagram page if you want to follow me, and it's because obviously the Nature and Science Museum does so much more than this. This is just like a small aspect,
Right,
but this
yeah.
is like the biggest part of my life because I'm so excited about it. So I made a highlight on my page that is for the DMNS collab, and you can go pick. That's like linked. Everything is there, photos, behind the scenes stuff, like little videos and everything of all the artists and at the museum. And my handle is @HonestBird, all one word, on Instagram. And I own Nest Art Collective. It's @nest.art.co if you want to see all the other artists as well.
A lot of them were extremely helpful throughout this entire process as well.
Yeah.
Oh, they're all such nerds. I literally told them that they were going to be able to do this, and one of them cried. So we're all very excited.
We ended up
bunch of geeks.
as kind of a culmination of this, in order to finish labeling all the molds, we had like 5 or 6 of them on the museum floor at tables labeling molds for like 3 hours.
Wow.
And visitors could just come up and chat with us while we were doing that. And honestly, it was a really incredible experience. Sierra and I were there talking about the paleontology side, and the tattoo artist talked about the tattoo side, and it was really fun.
Yeah, it was awesome. I have so
did
many
Annika-
great pictures. Oh, sorry.
I was going to ask if Annika got a count of how many kiddos came by that day. Do you remember?
Yeah,
It was a lot.
Probably did, but
I
I
don't
don't know. It
remember
was
off the top of my
quite
head,
popular.
but we have to for reporting for the museum, so I just don't remember. But
Yeah,
there were
I
so
feel like
many
I
good
talked-
pictures of like kids with you, like talking about the tattoos, and I was like, this is exactly what I want. They were all
Me
so
too.
excited, and I was like, haha, future tattoo havers.
Yes, and my artist, one of them dressed up like this frizzle. Like, it's just
Yeah.
my joy in life. I'm like, this is amazing. It was so fun.
Awesome. So I won't take up any more of your guys' time. Again, thank you so much for being here. This has been episode 138, part 2 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. We will see you all next week, since this is a bonus episode coming out sort of in between weeks. Until then, take care, everybody. This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.